Chapter 3 concerns informal fallacies. A fallacy, remember, is simply a mistake in reasoning. An informal fallacy is a mistake in reasoning that concerns an argument's content. This is contrasted with a formal fallacy, which is a mistake in reasoning concerning an argument's form. As we go through each of the fallacies in this chapter, the goal is twofold. First, we want to learn how to identify each of the fallacies, and second, we want to learn how to evaluate them. Section 3.2 concerns fallacies of ambiguity. Remember that a fallacy of ambiguity occurs because of some unclarity that occurs during the course of an argument. We'll consider each of these in turn. Equivocation, remember, occurs when you have a term that changes meaning during the course of an argument. So, in order to identify equivocation, you should look for such a term. When we evaluate the argument, we need to identify which term is used equivocally and then explain how it has changed meaning. In other words, you should be able to state what the multiple meanings are. Here's an example. Doing homework can be a real headache sometimes. Taking ibuprofen gets rid of my headaches, so taking ibuprofen is a great way to get rid of my homework. Now this is an example of equivocation because the word headache changes meanings. In the first instance, it's used metaphorically. When you say that doing homework can be a real headache, that doesn't mean that it's literally a headache. In the second instance, however, the term headache is used literally. The second informal fallacy is amphibole. To identify amphibole, what you're looking for is an ambiguity caused by poor grammar or punctuation. So dangling modifiers, run-on sentences, unclear reference, lack of context, and so on can all lead to this fallacy. Also, if an example makes you chuckle, there's a good chance that it's amphibole. When we evaluate amphibole, be able to state what the grammatical or punctuation problem is and explain how it leads to an unjustified inference. Here's an example. Headline: Case of man accused of killing stepfather in limbo. The reader says, "Wow, I didn't think our legal system extended that far." In the analysis, you would say something like, this is an example of amphibole because the headline structure causes the reader to think that the murder occurred in limbo, i.e. purgatory. But in fact, what the headline means is that the case itself is in limbo. In other words, it's stuck in the process. A third fallacy of ambiguity is accent. With accent, what you're looking for is something being given improper emphasis. It's being accented when it shouldn't. So a word can be over or underemphasized, or a word or passage can be ripped from context, which changes its meaning, or tone of voice can be misread. In order to evaluate this fallacy, be able to state how what is being improperly emphasized is misleading to somebody. So here's an example. In the movie My Cousin Vinny, a police officer asks the character Bill, "When did you shoot the clerk?" Bill replies in surprise, "I shot the clerk? I shot the clerk?" The police officer later reads Bill's statement as a confession in court. Then he said, "I shot the clerk, I shot the clerk." So the police officer here is clearly committing the fallacy of accent by taking Bill's question out of context, stripping it of its tone, and turning it into an admission of guilt. The final two fallacies of ambiguity are related. In fact, they're basically the flip side of one another. As the name composition suggests, you're composing. So an arguer will say something about the parts or members of a whole or group in the premises, and then say something about the whole or group itself in the conclusion. The parts or members have been put together, that is, composed, in the conclusion. Here's an example. All the planets in our solar system orbit around the sun, so the solar system orbits around the sun. In the analysis, we want to say how the property being attributed to the parts or members in the premises doesn't necessarily translate to the whole or group. Here we would say, this is a fallacy of composition. The planets in our solar system orbit around the sun, but as the sun is part of the solar system, it's absurd to say that the solar system itself orbits around the sun. Now, as I've said, the flip side of this is division. As the name suggests, this fallacy involves dividing up. So you say something about a whole or a group in the premises, and then divide up the whole or group to say something about the parts or members in the conclusion. So in evaluating this, we want to note how the property attributed to the whole or the group doesn't necessarily translate to the members of the parts. For example, the federal government has become bloated, So the U.S. Commercial Service, which promotes international trade, is overfunded. This is a fallacy of division. While it might be the case that the federal government is bloated, it doesn't follow that every part of it is. In fact, many programs, like the U.S. Commercial Service, are woefully underfunded. As you've probably noticed, each of the fallacies in this section follows a particular pattern. Being able to recognize these patterns will really help in identifying all of the fallacies. This is true not only of the fallacies in this section, but of the fallacies throughout the chapter. Being able to recognize the patterns will go a long ways towards helping us to evaluate the arguments.